With the engine removed, a couple of connections. This one goes down to the secondary air pump, which is actually down behind that front right radiator. You've got the fuel tank vent valve, which connects to that pipe which goes to the intake manifold. You've got the two fuel lines, both the inlet and the outlet, that go to obviously the fuel manifold at the top. This is your secondary air line, which actually connects to a pipe at the back of the engine for the secondary air injection. This is the connection at the back, which actually goes to your heater core. Simple pull out little wire thing that allows it to be disconnected. Complete pain in the bum to try and get this out, because this is fairly well stuck in there. Over this side, we've got that connection which actually came from the vacuum line that came from the front of the intake manifold and runs underneath the intake manifold and connects to that pipe at the back, and that actually goes to the reservoir, which is down in the wheel well here. That's the connection that goes to the main brake reservoir, the brake vacuum line. The connection goes in there, as well as it connects to this one, and that goes up to the little vacuum pump on this side. This is the inside of the lock carrier. So the cable for the bonnet unlatch is there. There's an electrical connector to that as well that runs down here, and it's part of that one there. That plug also splits to go down to the horn, which is just there. Other electrical connectors, you've got this big fat one here where a plug goes into, that one there, which goes to this fan. There's a couple of cable ties that you'll need to remove prior to pulling that out, and that lifts up and pulls out. That's sort of just slotted in there. The other fan, the electrical connector for that is this big fat one here. Again, these cable ties will need to be removed, and there's another one here and there prior to actually pulling that out. To remove the fans, the big one here, there are 4 bolts that hold it in, and they look like they are M10 bolts. These look like they're probably a T40 or maybe T30, something like that, Torx, and there's 4 of those as well. There's this little strut bracing piece here, which doesn't need to be removed. You can just unbolt those and it'll just slide out either this way or that way, and is easily cleared. The radiator itself, bottom left, is I think the outlet, inlet, top right. Also, for an automatic transmission, the fluid that's cooled that comes from the transmission goes through the radiator. There's a connection point here, a single bolt there to remove, and that'll just pull straight out. It'll have O-rings on the inside, and another one there to remove this bottom one. This one here runs straight back to the transmission. This one runs to the auxiliary cooler, which sits behind the left auxiliary radiator, which is about there somewhere. Other things, this big metal piece here, which runs to the other side, that's what actually bolts to those 2 big pieces that come out either side of the engine. This is all plastic, but this bit's actually metal. And this is where the snub mount actually connects into. So when you've removed this or just loosened off the front to do work at the front of the car, you're going to loosen these 4 bolts, put the snub mount in there, obviously with the engine in the correct position, and then tighten these up so it holds it securely. On this side of the engine, you would have the starter motor, which actually bolts in here. There are 2 bolts, one that actually comes from the transmission side, the one that comes from the engine side to hold that in place. 3 engine mount bolts, and then in front of that you would have the generator sit here, and behind here is the oil cooler. The way the oil cooler works is it's just a little heat exchanger. There is an inlet and an outlet port for the oil that have 2 O-rings on them, which just compresses hard against the oil filter, which has a flat surface when you put that in place. Over the top of that sits a mount, which is for the generator, and then the generator actually sits on top of it there, and then obviously at the front there we have the drive belt for the generator. There are two coolant lines here, one that goes to the oil cooler, so it goes to the oil cooler, goes through the oil cooler and then back up into the coolant system, and the one at the bottom here comes or goes to the generator, which again goes through the outside shell of the generator and back to the coolant system at the front. The oil cooler and generator setup. The oil cooler sits back here. There are 5 screws that attach it. There's 1 in each corner and 2 at the front, and there's a 5th up the top here which attaches to the cylinder head. In front of that is this big bracket here. There are 5 bolts that you can only see 2 here. There are 2 M10 at the top, and there are 3 behind the generator that are M8. And then for the generator itself, there are just 2 bolts that bolt in from the front, above and below. From the front side, you can see one of those attachment bolts, the other one's behind here, behind the tensioner. You've got the idle pulley here. When I attached that, the 22 Newton meters that was specified actually snapped at the bolt at the head. So what I've done is I've actually taken that head, drilled an 8mm hole through it, and actually put an 8mm bolt through the middle of the thing, and that seems to be working fine. For the tensioner itself here, basically put 70 Newton meters on the big bolt that's actually attached to the tensioner itself to actually tighten everything up, and then you tighten the bottom one here to 22 Newton meters. At the back, for the cooling, for the oil cooler itself, you can see the line, because this is actually up here is where the direct line of the coolant comes out, goes straight up and into the oil cooler, and then out the top up here, up that one there. And for the generator, obviously the coolant comes out from the pump side right through here, in through the void on the outside of the generator, and then back to the radiator and the cooling system up the front there. The power steering pump, you've got the inlet here which I've taped up, the outlet, sorry, the inlet here which is the low pressure side, the outlet here which is the high pressure side. You can see above here the power steering shaft. The way this is attached, there are 2 bolts at the end here, and in addition to that you've got this big long shaft which actually runs all the way through to actually go onto the clamp on the other side, and there'll be a nut here which actually holds everything on the rearward side of the bell housing. So you remove the nut and you put an 8mm socket on that, and then just remove that whole shaft, and then with those 2 bolts there out, it then allows it to come off. The power and steering pump assembly has actually got a big bracket here which is bolted to the pump prior to actually installing it, and it's bolted using three screws, and they're on the other side. You can't really see them here, but once you actually get the whole bracket and pump assembly off, they're pretty easy to see. The way it actually attaches is a shaft in here, which is actually a separate piece which connects to the accessory gearbox at the back of the engine. There's a little O-ring that actually seats in between that side there, or sorry, the engine side and the actual shaft itself, so make sure you don't lose that, and there's just a couple of splines that it sits on either side. The mount for the air conditioning compressor is in here. There are 2 bolts that hold it on. They both have dowels, so make sure they're nice and clean prior to actually installing that if you need to pull that off. The points that actually attach to the air conditioning compressor, there are 2. They're actually part of the bracket, and there's a forward one here which goes onto the cylinder block. So there are 3 bolts, 1 long one here at the front and 2 shorter at the back that attach to the air conditioning compressor. The attachment points for the air conditioning compressor, 1, 2 and 3. With the shaft, you can actually just push that all the way back. When it's like that, it actually disengages the gear back inside the accessory gearbox, so you can just turn that around as required. But then if I actually then put that, once that actually slots into the gear and actually push that forward, I can't turn that, and the way to engage it is then to just turn that, and that will actually screw, as you can see, that shaft on. And when you tighten the shaft itself, because obviously now this cannot turn, is that I hold this here and I actually turn the input to the air conditioning and compressor to actually tighten those two together. This is the air conditioning shaft. It just slots in there like that, and this boot just fits nice and snugly over the top of this. To actually remove it, I just got a plastic prying tool and just sort of worked my way around and just pulled that off. This is obviously with the air conditioning compressor removed, and that just pulls out. It's actually pretty tight, just gunged up with old grease and stuff, and if I was to pull out the engine, definitely pull this off and re-grease it. It only takes a few moments, but then you've re-greased that up, because some people have had problems with that shaft corroding, etc. over time. Once you're done, just plonk that back in there, and then you can, and I'd probably do this after I've actually fitted the air conditioning compressor and tightened up this end of the shaft. Then you can move that over the end here and just move it around and fit it again. This is the water pump. You've got the drive of the actual pump in here. We've got the thermostat over this side. The return lines are all on this side, and the output is all over here. So when the pump actually turns, which is driven by a hex shaft, which comes out of here, which comes from the little gears that that turn the actual oil pump. When fluid gets pumped, it gets pumped in a couple of directions. It comes out of here, and it also comes out of the big one here. The one on this side goes straight into the engine block in there, and that actually goes down to cylinders 5 through 8. And the other one out of here goes across that long pipe that goes across to the other side of the engine, and actually goes in on over near the generator pulleys, and that feeds cylinders 1 through 4, as well as the oil cooler and the generator, etc. To actually put this in, this little thing just slides in and out. You got to push that in and make sure that completely engages so it can't be turned. It should actually push a long way in there. Now that actually can't be turned now because that's attached to the accessory gearbox. So to actually fit this, what we're going to do is have a look at what orientation this is. Make sure that this is actually in the correct orientation. You've got a seal on the inside here, which is actually going to go over this shaft, and there's another seal on the inside of this pipe, which is actually going to go around here. So make sure they're all nice and clean, and then all we're going to do is gently push that straight on and then bolt it on. If it's not aligned properly, you may have to pull that off and readjust to make sure everything goes in okay. This is the front coolant line, which I've installed after the pump has gone in. What I've found with putting the pump in, if you just put the lightest smearing of oil on the seals and the shafts, then that'll actually allow it to push on in much more easily, because the seals were quite tight. Also the shaft that comes from the accessory gearbox to actually drive the coolant pump, it will engage first before the seals start to get tight, so it's pretty obvious if the actual shaft isn't aligned correctly with where it's actually going to go into the pump. The front coolant line, you can see it actually comes out of here, as well as the bit back here which goes into this side of the engine. This drives all the way along and goes into the other side of the engine. To get that off, there's the snub mount support which sits on the front here. You take that off, and then there's just a few bolts, and that just pops straight out. This one here is an O-ring seal which sits on the actual pipe itself, which pushes to the inside of the pump, and this one here is actually on the lower or the upper oil pan itself, and this is a nice flat plate which sits and compresses against it. This is the snub engine mount which just goes on the front here. This is the mount itself which just slides straight on and off this shaft. This is the OEM style one, which is actually quite soft. I'm just about to replace that with a polyurethane one, so it lasts a little bit longer because these actually degrade and just get trashed pretty easily. When you're actually fitting this actually gets torqued to the lower oil pan, and then when you actually put the lock carrier back in position, it actually slots back over the top of this. The actual sort of funny round piece that this actually slides around, you have that loose, and then once you actually slide it on so it's in the correct position with all the engine mounts and everything tied down, that's when you actually tighten up the bit on the bumper so everything's nice and secure. This is the coolant pipe that runs along the back of the engine. It's a little skinny pipe that joins from the bottom of the expansion tank, goes to a T-piece here. This piece here runs down to a small line that connects to the hard coolant line that's at the back of the engine, and this one runs along to where it actually connects to the radiator connection here at the front right of the front right of the car, and this small line joins all that together. Now, the problem with these is they're actually, this piece here, and I've replaced this piece over here before, is made of plastic. At the end of it is a metal piece which is inserted, which is inside here, which then actually is the bit that it actually clamps onto at the connection point. Unfortunately, these break. They're actually a pretty rubbish design. I've actually nearly cooked my engine before when this one actually went and just drained the coolant as we were driving down the freeway, and it was only the oil temperature that gave away that something was wrong. Pulled over and found coolant obviously everywhere underneath the engine base, so I replaced that, and I'm in the process of replacing this one. When I pulled the engine out and pulled everything apart, this was clearly leaking, and as soon as I started to manoeuvre it, the thing just snapped off. So I'm just going to replace that with just normal coolant line. So what I suggest you do is, there are two connections here, just remove those completely. Buy yourself some 3/8 or 8mm coolant line, get some brass connectors like that, and just connect those with clamps, etc., and with another piece over there, and that'll basically last forever. This is the drive shaft. Getting this apart was particularly difficult just because of the setup of it. It's a bit difficult to show here, but the actual gap inside here to remove the nut is tiny. The only way I could actually get that off was to grind back a ring spanner. It's a 17mm ring spanner to about 3mm wide, and that was only just enough to actually get in here, and it took me a long time to eventually loosen that off. Once you've actually got it loosened, there's some Loctite on it, and once that's loose, the best way I found to then remove it was to make sure that there was no pressure on it, and then just use a little magnetic tool and just get the nut the screw, and just gradually move it around to get it off, and then eventually it'll slide out. Obviously, as you can see, prior to doing that, I'm going to mark either side of that to ensure that it goes back in the same orientation. Once that bit has been removed, again, there's there's no gap at all inside here to get a bearing puller on the inside. So the best way to do this is actually have your bearing puller established here, and to obviously pull it out that way, and that'll just take the bearing with it. When you're actually installing, the easiest way to, rather than actually pull it on with the screw, because it's such a pain to actually get it in there, whack that on there first with something that's an appropriate size, so it's just hitting the inner race of the bearing, and then put this back on, so you've just got a tiny little bit of movement available where it's loose with the screw, and you're using that magnetic tool and then moving it a little bit, turning it a few turns, because it really is quite difficult. Make sure you put some Loctite before you start that process, so it's all nice and locked once you're done. This is the starter motor. There are two bolts that hold it to the engine and transmission. You got one that actually comes from the transmission side, which actually bolts through the belt housing. There's another one that actually comes through here and actually bolts into the transmission belt housing from the engine side. Pretty standard starter motor. You got a solenoid here. When that activates, it pulls the plunger this way. There's then a fork which moves the sprocket here forward. And once that's engaged, it also, when this when the solenoid moves, it actually makes a switch in here which then allows power to drive the motor. So it turns over, and as soon as you release the starter mechanism, this plunges back in and removes the sprocket from the flywheel. Pulling it apart is pretty simple. Two screws on the top. Just remove those. In addition to that, on the other side here there is the small nut that connects the electrical contact from the solenoid to the motor itself. Once you remove that, you can just gently hold onto this bit here and pull that off. This will actually disconnect this position here, but for the moment I actually want to keep that on there. I'm just going to remove the top off. On the inside, what you can see is there's a needle bearing in here. This will be full of gunk and whatever, just clean all that out, and when you put it back together again, just re-grease the needle bearing. Once that off, there's a little sort of plastic cover here that needs to come off. And then once you're inside there, you can see the brushes to the unit. So I've got 4 brushes, and there are springs that hold each of those in. What you don't want to do is just pull the center shaft out from the bottom. You actually want to remove all of these springs first. They just pop out just with a little baby pry tool. And then once you've done that, all the spring pressure is actually taken off the brushes, and you can just gently remove this whole unit here. The electrical contact comes up with it, and that'll just sit there quite happily. On the inside of here, there's a bunch of gunk. I just cleaned all that out, and all I did was just clean up the brushes themselves. You're going to see from here that when at the maximum extent, so the maximum size of the brushes, they only go into about that far. So there's actually very little wear. This car had over 200,000 kilometres on it, so there's surprising little wear, so there's absolutely no need for these brushes to be replaced. That's got years of life left into it. And all I did was just get some solvent and clean up all of the insides to the brushes. Once it's like that, you can just pull that up. Actually, you've got the sprocket here which joins into the small gearbox that's inside there, and these are the contacts obviously for where the brushes run around. Again, there's a bit of gunk all over that, just clean it up with solvent so everything's like new. On the inside here, we've just got a cover there. Again, just clean all that up, and then on the inside here, you've got the gearbox, which is just a little standard gearbox, reduction gearbox, one stage that actually drives to the shaft at the front. Then what you can do, because that'll just stay in there like that, you can then turn it over, and we're going to remove these screws here and remove the solenoid plunger, or remove the solenoid itself. Once you remove those screws, that'll just pop out. You can see the solenoid is that one there, the actual switch that when it activates, that gets pressed in. It's that one inside there, and that's going to get pressed and then allow current to flow to the motor once the plunger actually moves. You can see the plunger there. It's got a spring around it, so that can just be removed. This little piece in here, which is the separator between the solenoid and the motor, can remove, and now this whole thing can actually be pulled out, and all I'm going to do is just gently turn that over and everything will just fall straight out. For the cover itself, on the inside up the back here is another needle bearing for the other end of the motor, so again, clean all that out, re-grease it prior to putting it all back together again. Other than that, it just needs a good clean out. For the solenoid plunger, we've got our arm here, which is, as that moves, is going to push this forward like that. It actually goes into here, and so as that actually goes that way, it's going to pull that forward and engage the flywheel, and as soon as it's disconnected, that the spring pressure here pushes it that way and actually disconnects it and disengages it from the flywheel. For all of this, you could pull this off at the front, however I didn't do that. I'm just going to, it's quite easy to clean all this up just with some solvent. You can actually push that out like that, so you can clean up all of these gears here, make sure everything's nice and clean, get all the gunk out of that, and then we're just going to re-grease everything prior to pulling it all back together again. To put it back together is the reverse. What I'm going to do firstly is engage this fork mechanism with the gearbox and the sprocket, and I'm just going to gently feed that back in there. Again, I would have re-greased everything prior to actually doing this. Just get your hands up in here to allow that to slot up into the right spot, and when you're doing this, there is this bit here which actually needs to stay aligned here at the top so everything slots in nicely. And once that slots in nicely, we can just sit that there like that. I can put in this piece here, so I'm just going to slot that down like that. There's a little knob here which sort of sits up the top there. And then from there I'm going to put the solenoid on. So to put the solenoid on, the easiest way to do that is to actually get that spring, actually push that on there like that, and then we're going to align it, and the actual contact there needs to be on the inside here. So we're going to put that over the top and we just push that straight down. It just clicks straight on, and then I'm just going to put those two screws in there to hold that together. So once it's in this position here, now I'm going to get my little cover here that goes in this orientation, and you can see that there are two little notches here and they align. It's pretty obvious when you actually are doing it with the plastic piece of that outside ring gear. Once it's on there, this will slot straight back in there. So when we're putting this on, just make sure all of the brushes are nicely in there and in a position where it'll be able to slot down, and you'll just use some sort of tool to make sure they're in the right position and they don't get moved out of the way. That slots down, and you can connect the connector at the back here. Once we've got this piece on, now I'm going to put all the springs in. So all I need to do is just compress those with my fingers, and they'll just slide straight in. Once all the brushes are in there, just plonk our plastic piece on the top. That will slot in over the plastic piece, and then you can see the notch here. That'll just align on the other side here with the electrical connector, and that just slides straight on. And once that's on, we can just connect those, and obviously connect the nut on there as well. The final check to see if the starter motor works correctly. I've got the negative terminal of the battery hooked up with jumper cables to just the outside shell of the starter motor. I've got the positive from the battery going to the terminal on the solenoid, and you can see I've got a wire which is currently not connected to the battery, which is connected to the terminal on the inside here, which is the other side of the solenoid. And if I touch that on the positive terminal, I should see the starter motor move to the side and start to spin straight away. And there we go, so obviously that works fine. Dismantling the alternator to get the coolant lines out, just remove the Allen key screw, remove the plate that holds it all in, and then you can just wiggle all these out. There's an O-ring on each of these, which is obviously for sealing it. And they just pop straight out. They should be a little bit stiffer than that when you first remove them. Pull the cover off the back here, just the B+ terminal, you can pull that nut off there. Then there are 3 E5 screws that hold on the plastic cover. Remove those. And once you remove that, you'll see the plug connector. These 3 screws are mostly removed. They would obviously be all the way in there. We've got the gadget here that holds the brushes, which are inside here, and all of this bit here are the connections to the stator on the other side of the alternator. To actually change the brushes over, you need to remove these 3 E5 Torx screws. So pull those out. And then to actually get this thing out, we're actually just going to lift this thing up here a little bit, and then we're just going to pull that out. And the brushes are in there. These are brand new ones. The old ones are here. This is what they look like. They would normally be up to about there somewhere. So you can see one of those is fairly worn, the other one is pretty much gone. And I don't think this had much life left in it. When I actually pull those out, it barely protrudes out of here, which means it's putting very little pressure on there, so that would start to fail very shortly. The brushes themselves are pretty simple to purchase on eBay. They cost me about $10. This is a Delphi alternator, so you just look online for that, and they're pretty simple to find. On the other side, to remove the pulley, we've got a fitting here on the inside just to hold the shaft, which is an M10 triple square. So that would just go in there like that, and you can use an 8-ring spanner, shifting spanner, whatever you like to loosen it up, pull that off, and then the pulley just comes straight off. To remove this front cover off, behind the pulley there was just that little piece which helps secure the pulley in place. You can just pull it straight off, and then there are 4 screws there, E7 screws. You can remove those, and then the best way to do this is to just turn it over and just gently push it out, and you can remove the stator away from it. That's the stator itself. There. On mine, this was completely gunged up with filth and dirt and oil, so you can just immerse that quite happily in solvent and clean all that out. On the other part, which is the rotor, there are 2 bearings. So one at the back end, and there are the brush contacts there for the rotor. To actually get at this bearing and to replace it, you obviously have to press that or pull that off with a bearing remover. I was a bit worried about actually damaging contacts, so what I did was I just pried. There's actually a metal piece here. You just pry that off with a screwdriver around it, and it'll eventually just pop straight off. And then all I did was just get a pick tool and pop the cover off the bearing, clean it all out with solvent. You actually quite happily immerse this whole thing in solvent and wash it out completely, and then re-grease the whole thing, press a whole bunch of new bearing grease and pop the cover back on, and it should be like new. Unless the thing's completely toast, that should be sufficient to put a whole bunch more life back into the thing.
On the other side, this is an interference fit on both sides, on both the shaft and also this here. To actually get that out would be quite difficult without actually breaking that. However, you can get a pick tool and actually pick that cover out quite happily. Again, immerse the whole thing in solvent, clean it all out, re-grease it, pop the cover back on, and then she's as good as gold. Putting everything back together again. So to install, I'm just going to put the rotor back inside, and then we're going to put those 4 E7 Torx screws back in. That little piece goes on there, pulley goes on, nut goes on. Obviously you would tighten that by holding that centre triple square and a spanner on the other side. For the other side, to fit the new brushes, so to actually get that apart, it's pretty simple. When you look at it, there's a couple of little clips here, so you just gently pry those apart and that top will pop off, and that'll actually allow you to replace both of those brushes. There, the contacts there on this side, obviously the new brushes are in there. And probably the best way to do this is to get something to push that in, so you can hold it in with your fingers, being nice and careful, and then just shove it like that with your fingers. And then what we're going to do is lift that up and feed that up over the top of it, so everything fits into place. And gently manoeuvre it so everything goes into the right spot. And then once it's in there, like so, then you can go and put those 3 Torx screws back in there.